Hi, my name is Eric Huntsman, and I believe I'm one of the first presenters in the Interpreter Foundation and the Cruise Lady Learn Your Religion series on the religious and cultural history of Turkey. We all grew up calling it Turkey, but our friends there prefer that we use the name Turkey. Let me just say a few things about myself, and then I will introduce my topic. I am a professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University. I actually began at BYU in 1994 in classics, not in religion, transferred to religious education in 2003. I remain affiliate faculty with classics, as well as the Ancient Near Eastern Studies program and with Global Women's Studies at BYU. And I'm actually broadcasting to you from Jerusalem, which is why I'm not there at the Learn Your Religion Hall, giving this lecture in person. I'm on a 2.5-year assignment as the academic director of the BYU Jerusalem Center and having a fantastic time here. Let me just tell you a bit about my connection with Turkey and why I love it so much and why I was happy when Steve contacted me to record this lecture for you. I first went to Turkey in 2004. My faculty mentor, Kent Jackson, at the time took me and 2 other colleagues on a Journey of Paul tour through Greece and Turkey for about 3.5, almost 4 weeks. That was the first time I'd ever gone there. Now, as a classicist, I knew a little bit about that part of the world. I often will tell people that Turkey is one of the great undiscovered wonders of the world. People always think of going to Italy or Greece or the Holy Land, but I often like to remind them that there are as many and some of the greatest Greek ruins in Turkey as there are in Greece. And of course, Ephesus is one of the phenomenal Roman cities of the world. Anyway, Kent Jackson took us on this Journey of Paul trip, and they had started actually in Greece. I got there a little later because my father had just passed away, but I joined them in Istanbul, and we flew to Adana, and then we got a van, and we drove from Tarsus near the Syrian border, and we kind of traced the routes of Paul through central Turkey and then the western coast of Turkey, saw all of those great sites, and then ended up in Istanbul, which is a fantastic city, which is going to be mostly what we're going to talk about today. And I was so enthralled with Turkey that when I received an Alcuin Fellowship a number of years later, in 2010, I went to Greece for 2.5 weeks with a buddy, and then a former student of mine and I went to Turkey for another 3 weeks. And then when I came to BYU Jerusalem Center for the first time in 2011, that year, we didn't go to Egypt. All 3 semesters we went to Turkey. So I had a chance to go to Turkey 5 times early in my career. And we just actually went there this past March or February with the BYU Jerusalem Center program. So Turkey is just a wonderful, wonderful place. Fantastic sites. You can go all the way back to the Bronze Age. We've got some very early human settlements there and the great Bronze Age empire of the Hittites. And of course, I mentioned the Greek cities of the coast. We talked about the Roman Empire. And as a young man, I got enthralled with my topic today, which is the so-called Byzantine Empire. And I always tell my students here in the Holy Land, since the Eastern Roman Empire controlled the Holy Land in Jerusalem for about 200 years, that the best way to understand who the Byzantines are Greek-speaking Christian Romans. So I was a young man, and I remember flipping through my World Book Encyclopedia, B volume, and came upon this entry about 10 pages long on the Byzantines, and I was just enthralled by it. And in particular, I fell in love with this great Greek Orthodox cathedral in Constantinople, we now call Istanbul, called Hagia Sophia. And I remember as a young boy tracing it and drawing its floor plan and just trying to imagine what it was like. That was a great thing when Kent and our group, we went through to Hagia Sophia in Istanbul the first time. I thought, wow, this is great. So anyway, I've been asked to talk about the Byzantine period, and in particular, its culture. And so I'm going to go ahead and toggle over, if you don't mind, to a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share with you some slides. We're going to first talk a little bit about the history of the Byzantine Empire to give you a better feel for who the Eastern Roman, the Greek-speaking Christian Romans were. And then we're going to spend the last half hour looking at some wonderful church architecture and the art of Byzantium. All right, so let me go ahead and start this PowerPoint, and so we can look at some of these wonderful slides. Now, I have entitled my presentation, The Second Rome, the Beauty and Culture of Byzantium, and we're starting with this lovely slide. I just took this in February of the inside of Hagia Sophia, now the Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque. But before we can get to Hagia Sophia, I want to give you a little bit of a background on the Byzantine Empire and Byzantine culture. Notice that we called this presentation the Second Rome. So I have two different images juxtaposed there. The first is a model of classical Rome. This is Rome at the time of the Emperor Trajan, I believe, on the left. And then on the right, you have this kind of depiction of Constantinople, the Second Rome. So these are two cities that both claimed to be the seats of Roman power and culture, very similar in some ways, very different in other ways. So let's talk about how Rome moved from the ancient city of classical Rome to the late antiquity and then medieval city of Constantinople. So let's talk about the Eastern Roman Empire. Now on this map, the Roman Empire is in pink, and you see it at a particular point in its history. If you add the tan or the orange sections, that's the Roman Empire at its greatest extent under the Emperor Trajan, but was always under pressure from the Persians and Parthians in the east and Germanic and other quote-unquote barbarian tribes in the north. And that at a particular time in its history, an emperor decided that Rome itself was not the most secure place to run his empire. While the Western Roman Empire came under increasing attacks by the German tribes, Constantine, the emperor in the early 4th century, thought that it was prudent to move the capital from Rome in Italy to a new site, the city of Byzantium, which was a Greek city strategically located between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea and through the Aegean to the Mediterranean. Let me just go ahead and circle that with a purple circle there. That is Byzantium. So you can see it's right there on some straits connecting the Black Sea and the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, and it lies poised between Europe and Asia. So Constantine moved his capital there, greatly expanded the older Greek city of Byzantium, and renamed it after himself as the city of Constantine, or Constantinopolis, or in modern Greek, Constantinopoli. So while the Western Roman Empire continued to suffer invasions and eventually collapsed, the East remained strong for another couple centuries. And so Constantinople found itself as the capital of the eastern half of the empire, which remained, as I put here on the PowerPoint slide, rich, civilized, and cosmopolitan. So why did Constantine choose the site of Byzantium for his new capital? And so I have two different maps here. The first one is showing you kind of a broader scale how the site of Constantinople was positioned on a strait called the Bosphorus. So you see where Constantinople is there on that little peninsula, kind of towards the lower center part of the slide. And you see the blue inlet or strait that goes all the way up. And in the upper right corner of the slide is where it broadens out into the Black Sea. Now, just south of Constantinople is not the Aegean or Mediterranean Sea yet. It's an intermediate body of water called the Sea of Marmara. And the Sea of Marmara then has another set of straits, the Gallipoli Straits or the Dardanelles, that go to the Aegean and through the Aegean to the Mediterranean. So that is the geographic positioning of Constantinople. But you'll see that there are a number of cities on the Bosphorus Strait. So why did he pick this particular one? So let me superimpose here a closer view of the site of Byzantium and Constantinople itself. So you see the Bosphorus labeled there and the Sea of Marmara to its south. And you see a third body of water, a thinner inlet going up to the upper left corner of the slide called the Golden Horn. What this did is it presented a peninsula, a site that was protected on three sides by water. So it could control the trade through the Bosphorus and the Marmara, but it was also protected from land attack on all sides but the western side, where Constantine built some strong walls to defend it. So that is the new site of Constantinople. Byzantium was just the very tip of the peninsula originally, and Constantine expanded it out. And then later, another emperor named Theodosius built some walls even farther to the west. So let's talk about this new city for an old empire. And here we have a nice artistic depiction of Constantinople in its heyday. Now, Byzantium had been a medium-sized Greek city, but because of that strategic location, particularly on the sea lanes. It became very wealthy, very rich. And when Constantine moved his capital there, he refounded it as a Roman city. He built all the things a Roman city would have. Forums, which are large public squares. Sometimes they're actually ovals, but public areas, and a hippodrome or a racetrack. So you see it there in this slide. It's a version of what we have in Rome, the so-called Circus Maximus. And because Constantine, towards the end of his life, became the first Christian emperor, his mother had been Christian, he actually filled his city with all kinds of churches. So this is going to be the center of the Byzantine Empire from the time that Constantine moves his capital there, about 330, to the fall of this city to the Turks in 1453. So that's a long time, almost 1,100 years this was a thriving city. And so this new Rome, as I suggest here on this slide, was similar but different. Now, the old city of Rome, it's interesting, it wasn't in a particularly good place for either trade or for defense. It just happened to be the place where a Latin group called the Romans were successful in uniting their neighbors into a state which grew stronger and stronger and eventually took over the entire peninsula of Italy, and then from Italy to the Mediterranean Sea. So Rome became important because the Romans conquered the world, not because Rome itself was a particularly great site. It was on a small river called the Tiber River, and it was built on 7 hills. Now, interestingly enough, the site that Constantine chose had 7 hills as well. The old city of Byzantium was only on 2 of these hills, one right there on the tip of the peninsula, and another one, if you can see this closely, called the second hill. But Constantine rebuilt the city and expanded it and noted that there were 7 hills in this peninsula, like there had been 7 hills in the original site of Rome. And when he laid out his city, he developed it into 14 regions or districts, and classical Rome had 14 districts as well. But the difference, as I mentioned, was this was much better located. It was much more defensible because of its protection by bodies of water on 3 sides, and it was in a very commercially prone area where it could become quite rich because of all of its trade. Now, because of its location, when Constantine moved his capital there, that's because his empire really gravitated towards the east. The east was more populated, it was richer, it was less prone to attacks than the western part of the empire was. And as the Western Empire started to decline, Constantinople became more and more integrated into what had been the Greek East. So notice, as I put here in this last bullet point, it would be drawn more and more to the east. And as the Western Roman Empire fell and Rome became kind of a memory as Germanic kingdoms took its place and we moved through the Middle Ages, we developed feudal Europe and then Western Europe and eventually the Renaissance. But it was a much different civilization than what Byzantium was that had been oriented towards the east. Now, a quick disclaimer here. We keep talking about the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines. While there was a Greek city called Byzantium, founded in about 900 BC, and was taken over by the Macedonians, and the Persians, the Macedonians, and the various Hellenistic states, and eventually Rome. It was only the name of a town, Byzantion or Byzantium in its Latin version, until Constantine moved there in 330. And then when it was called the city of Constantine or Constantinopolis, no one used the term Byzantine again. Byzantine is actually a relatively modern term. Some French scholars were trying to differentiate the Eastern Roman Empire, particularly in its medieval phases, from the Roman Empire proper. And so they used this term Byzantine. But no one there ever called themselves Byzantines. In fact, even though they were Greek-speaking and only Roman in a sense of heritage, and they were a Christian civilization, very different from classical Rome, until the last the last Eastern Romans fell to the Turks, they called themselves the Romaioi, or the Romans. Okay, so the subjects of the Eastern Roman Empire always thought of themselves as Romans, even though their culture developed in some very new ways from classical Rome. So that's the continuity. Okay, the Byzantine Empire had the Roman tradition of law and government, and they had the name, and they considered themselves politically to be Romans. But there were quite a few changes, and I've already alluded to these. Greek displaced Latin when Constantine moved there. Constantine was a Roman emperor. He spoke Latin. In fact, the Eastern Roman emperors through Justinian spoke Latin, but eventually they just started to speak Greek, as most of the people in their empire did. And they stopped calling their leaders the Augusti, or the emperors, and started calling themselves basileis, which is just the Greek word for kings. Now, Constantine, as I mentioned, was the first emperor to be baptized as a Christian. It was just a few days or a couple of weeks before his death, but his mother had been Christian, and he had been very favorable towards the Christians throughout much of his reign. And with this favoritism from the emperor, and eventually another Eastern Roman emperor, Theodosius, made it the official Christianity, the official language of religion of the empire, we suddenly have a Christian civilization rather than a classically pagan one. And it was the Eastern variety of Christianity, what we call Eastern Orthodoxy, as opposed to what became Roman Catholicism in the West. And we've already mentioned that it was increasingly oriented towards the East. Now, Oriental is not a term we use very much anymore, but it simply means coming from the Latin Eastern. Okay, so it was oriented towards the East. Now, I'm just going to take another 7 to 10 minutes to talk about history, just to set up the stage for our cultural and religious discussion. But let me just kind of simplify this 1,000-year period of history, 1,100 years, actually, if we start with Constantine in 330 and go to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. We can put it into 5 main phases. So it was the Eastern Roman Empire until the 500s, mid-500s, when an emperor named Justinian managed to reconquer North Africa and Italy and even parts of Spain. He never reconquered France or Great Britain, but he conquered much of what had been the old Western Roman Empire. And so in his mind, he was restoring the grandeur of the original Roman Empire, and it was a period of great wealth, and he engaged in huge building projects, including Hagia Sophia, where we're going to spend a lot of our time the second half of our presentation today. Of course, at that very time, it actually ran into some turbulence. There was a plague, there were some wars, and perhaps Justinian overextended the empire. And by the 600s, it was under a lot of stress, particularly from not Germanic, quote unquote, barbarians, but from some other less civilized people from the north called the Slavic tribes, who invaded from what's now Ukraine and Romania and invaded what's now Serbia and Bulgaria. So the Eastern Roman Empire was losing some of its heartland in what we call the Balkans, the areas north of Greece. And on top of that, the Slavic attack, this new religion that the Prophet Muhammad started in Arabia, gave rise to what we call the Islamic empires, and Arab invasions wrested Jerusalem, which, was not one of the larger cities of the Byzantine Empire, but certainly spiritually was its focus. And so the Holy Land in Jerusalem was lost to these Islamic Arab invaders in 638. And soon the rest of the Holy Land and Syria and Egypt and North Africa fell to the Muslims. And so the empire, as I suggest here, was withdrawing. And it was becoming a much smaller empire focused on what we now call Turkey, Anatolia or Asia Minor, as well as Greece and those part of the Balkans that the Slavs had not wrested from it. And so it looked like it was contracting and on its way to, the dustbins of history. But in the 9th century, starting in the mid-800s, it was able to not only hold on to Anatolia, but expand a little into northern Syria and retake much of the Balkans under a great emperor called Basil II Bulgarotonos, which means Basil the Bulgar Slayer. He defeated the Bulgarians, the Slavic group that had taken a lot of the Balkans. And so the Byzantine Empire became a compact, only medium-sized state, but still by medieval standards, quite powerful. Then in the 11th century, there was another period of challenge. And unfortunately, this came from people who should have been the friends of the Byzantines. They had come under attack in the east by the Turkish tribes from Central Asia, who were invading Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, which had been the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so they had asked their Christian cousins, their Catholic cousins in the West for help. And so the Crusades began, ostensibly to push the Turks out of Turkey and to recapture Jerusalem for Christianity. But the Fourth Crusade, after the first 3 Crusades, had succeeded in helping the Byzantine Empire regain Anatolia or Turkey, and then the Crusaders themselves took Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and Syria, the Fourth Crusade actually seized Constantinople itself. So the first time Constantinople ever fell to a foreign adversary after it withstood all these attacks from Slavic tribes and Arab attacks, etc., was from fellow Christians. Venetians, other Italians had shipped over German and particularly French crusaders, and that struck a deadly blow. They seized Constantinople and much of Greece. Now, eventually, the Romaioi, the Greek-speaking Romans, were able to retake Constantinople, but the empire never regained its strength. And its last 200 years was the slow decline as they lost battle after battle to the Turks. And then in 1453, May 18th, 1453, a dark day in Byzantine history, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and the Ottoman Turks made it the capital of their new empire, which eventually became a powerful, really brilliant empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, until the end of World War I. So those are the 5 phases. Let me just show you some maps to get a feel for that, and then we'll move to our cultural discussion. So this map shows you the Eastern Roman Empire in orange. Okay, so that's what was the empire ruled by Constantinople. This is the Greek-speaking Christian Roman Empire. The tan areas are the areas that were retaken by Justinian in the mid-6th century, so the mid-500s. You see, they took Italy, part of Yugoslavia, all of North Africa, and a little bit of Spain. So that's the quote-unquote Byzantine Empire at its greatest extent. Now, here you see it in its withdrawal phase. It's lost all of Jerusalem and the Holy Land and Syria and Egypt and North Africa to the Muslims. And the Islamic armies are actually advancing into what we now call Turkey. And some of the northern parts of the Balkans have fallen to Slavic groups such as the Croatians and the Serbians and the Bulgarians. And virtually all of Italy has been lost. And so this is the Byzantine Empire in its second phase, its withdrawal and eventually a renewal. Now, this map shows it in its, we call it the second golden age. It's just in this period as the first golden age, but this is its medieval golden age under Basil II. And so you can see it's all of Turkey, as well as a little bit of Syria, the important Syrian city of Antioch, which is one of the Christian centers of Eastern Christianity. And you can see it has all of the Balkans and southern Italy, even a little bit of the Crimea, which is one of those points of contention between Ukraine and Russia now. So that was the medieval empire. And so by European standards, it's only medium sized. The Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne the Great is larger than this, but this was populous and it was rich and it was strong. Now, this map shows what happened when the Fourth Crusade was diverted from going to the Holy Land to reinforce the Crusaders in Jerusalem and turn it against Constantinople. So you see the purple areas are Crusader states, a principality in southern Greece called the Principality of Achaia, a duchy of Athens, a duchy in the Aegean Sea, the duchy of the archipelago, a kingdom in the important northern Greek city of Thessalonica. And all of these Crusader states were vassals of a new Latin as opposed to a Greek emperor in Constantinople. So you see that Latin empire there. Now, there were some refugees from Constantinople. One went to the east to part of Greece and Albania called Epirus anciently. But the main seat of resistance against the Crusaders was in the important city of Nicaea. And I think it's Dan Peterson, maybe it's Ken Jackson, one of them is going to talk about church councils. Nicaea was an important city, Greek city, and that's where some church councils were held in trying to determine the dogma or the creeds of post-apostolic Christianity. So you can see that there in that red area was a Byzantine refugee who crowned himself emperor not of Constantinople, but of Nicaea, and he used that northwestern state in northwestern Turkey to launch a counterattack, and eventually Constantinople was retaken and Thessalonica was retaken. So it was restored to the Byzantines, but never regained the strength it had before the Crusades. And so you see that Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The Seljuks were a Turkish group. They had a sultan, a Muslim or Islamic leader who was centered in a place called Iconium, right there in the middle of Turkey. Rum is just how the Arabs and the Turks described the Romaioi, the Greek-speaking Romans. So he saw himself as the sultan of the Romans, even though at this point the Turks haven't taken Constantinople. Now, this last map sadly shows you the Byzantine Empire when it's just a very faint echo of its old days. It has just that little purple area around the city of Constantinople itself, and it does have southern Greece. The Peloponnesus is purple there. The green parts belong to Venice, which had a love-hate relationship with the Byzantines. But you can see on either side of Constantinople is the Ottoman Turkish Empire in Turkey proper in the east, and the Turks had crossed Gallipoli and moved into Serbia and Bulgaria. And so they were already conquering parts of Europe before they took the Byzantine capital of Constantinople in 1453. That pennant or flag there, kind of the red and gold, is the Palaiologonian banner or flag. That's the last dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. And the B's there, the Greek betas, it's because the Byzantine Emperor used the title King of Kings, ruling a kingdom of kingdoms. So that was their old imperial pretensions, even though at this point they're hardly even a city-state. Okay, so that's the history of the Byzantine Empire. And what we want to do for the rest of our visit today is talk about their art and architecture. And we're going to talk about the architecture in almost purely ecclesiastical terms and church connections. The Byzantines, throughout their history, like the Roman predecessors, their Roman predecessors, were great civil engineers. They built aqueducts, they built hippodromes or racetracks, as we've noted, roads, cisterns, places to contain and store water, palaces. But their churches is where they really expended their greatest effort. And those are the things that have survived, although many of them have been converted into mosques. So let's talk about the art and architecture of the Byzantine Empire. And once again, it's going to be characterized by both continuity and change. So just like Constantinople, the second Rome had some continuity with its predecessor, the first Rome, and yet there were changes. We're going to see some continuity in architectural and engineering features and a lot of change in the art. And before we get to the Byzantine Empire proper, let's go back to the time of Constantine, because I don't think people in the 4th century, the 300s, were thinking of themselves as proto-Byzantines yet. Of course, they were always Romaioi in their own minds. They're still Romans proper, but they're becoming more and more Christian. So I want to talk about early Christian art and architecture, which in the East becomes Byzantine art and architecture. And I want to talk about the main two different approaches to church architecture. There was what perhaps became the most common way of designing a church, which is to use the basilica plan, and then what we call centrally planned churches, or a central planned church. Now, let me just a little bit of background here. Before Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius made Christianity a legal religion, it had been a persecuted religion. And so the early Christians weren't building churches. They were operating in homes and they were operating in secret. And so they weren't building large structures to worship in. But once they became legal and could buy property and build buildings to worship in, they had to decide what those buildings would look like, what those churches would look like. Now, what you need to know is that Greek and Roman temples, you think of those great classical temples with the columns, and the pediment, and what you always think of, like the Acropolis, the Parthenon on the Acropolis, they actually weren't meant for large congregational worship. Most Greek and Roman worship, like at the Jewish temple, took place outside of the temple. The crowds gathered in a Roman temple in the forum or the square, the precinct around the temple, and a Greek temple just in front of the temple. And the temple housed the cult statue, and the priest went in there, but the sacrifices took place outside. So that temple form did not provide the Christians, when they were finally legal and had the money to build houses of worship, with a good model. Instead, what they did is they looked at a Roman civic structure called the basilica. Now, basilica was originally a place where the courts were held. It was a civic structure, not a religious structure. And it actually took its name from an earlier Greek place called the King's House. Basilica comes from the Greek term basileus. So in the agora, or marketplace of Athens, there were some stoas, some colonnades where public business would take place. And there was a stoa basileikos, the king's stoa. Now, the Athenians were a democracy throughout the classical period of history, but they remembered that in the old archaic period, they had a king. And so they had actually a magistrate who still had the title of king because he took care of, like our Supreme Court, he took care of certain court cases, even though he was an annually elected magistrate. So that's where the term basilica comes from. Sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit. But the Romans used that term for these large halls where their judges would sit and hear court cases in front of crowds of people. And the basilica was basically a large columned hall with a large central room with aisles on the side. The aisles kind of demarcated from the central hall by columns. And that's so that people could gather in the main area, but people who were coming late or leaving early could go on the aisles on the side and not disturb what was taking place in the middle. And then at the end, there would be a semicircular area, usually with a half dome over it, called an apse, which is where the judge would sit. So the earliest Christian churches were basilicas. They found this to be a really useful form. They could put their altar in the apse where the judge used to sit. The congregation could gather in the central hall, what's called the nave, and people coming and leaving the service could enter and exit through these aisles on the side. But there were instances when instead of having a large columned hall for large meetings, they would use a domed circular structure or an octagon with a dome over it for mausolea, sometimes places that bury emperors, empresses, saints, but particularly for baptistries or to mark sacred spots. Okay, so you've got these two different approaches to churches: the centrally planned church, a dome on an octagon or a circle or a basilica. I'm going to go somewhere with this. When we look at Hagia Sophia in a moment, we're going to see that it's actually a combination of the large basilica, but also a centrally planned church. Now, let me just say a few words about Hagia Sophia, and then we're going to look at some basilicas, and we'll come back to Hagia Sophia in another part of this presentation. Hagia Sophia is just Greek for holy wisdom. And Constantine built a large church in his new capital, Constantinople, dedicated to holy wisdom. And it's not just wisdom in an abstract sense. Wisdom, Jesus was wisdom personified. So in a real way, the Church of Holy Wisdom was a church of Jesus Christ, if you will. And later, that church of Justinian was destroyed, and Theodosius had to, I think it was burned down, and Theodosius had to build another one. And so he replaced the Basilica of Constantine with another large basilica. But Justinian, that great emperor under whom the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent, rebuilt it a third time after some riots had burned down, virtually the whole city, including church. And here he combined the centrally planned church with the dome with the basilica. And we'll talk about this more in a moment. But interestingly enough, whereas the basilica is the main plan used by Western Christianity, think of all your cathedrals. They have a nave, they have aisles, they just add some two side pieces called transepts to make the plan look like a Latin cross. Byzantine churches are almost always centrally planned in later periods. Sometimes a cross in a square, sometimes an octagon, but almost always dome. To this day, Greek churches are almost always surmounted with a dome. Now let's go back a little to early Christian architecture, and this is a typical basilica. You see the nave in the middle, and you see two or sometimes four aisles. In this case, there are two aisles on each side rather than just one on each side. You see the semicircular area to the right, which is the apse, the altar is there. Bema or bema is just the raised platform where the clergy gather. And then you see there's some other things. A narthex is like our foyer or lobby, and there's an atrium, a courtyard in front of it. But this is a typical basilica, if you will. And here is a cross section of what that would look like. The nave has a much higher ceiling than either of the aisles. In fact, the word nave comes from the Latin word navis for ship. It's like a great ship sailing towards the altar in the apse. And by having the aisles be at a lower level, having lower ceilings than the nave, you can actually add a row of windows above the aisles that let light directly into the nave. And then you have other windows in the aisle itself. So that's a cross section of what a basilica looked like. And here is an actual example of a Byzantine basilica. It's in Italy, but it was built after Italy was reconquered by the Emperor Justinian. This is at a place called Ravenna, not as far north and east as Venice, but kind of in the northeastern part of Italy. And this was in that typical or the traditional basilica form. So you see the high nave in the middle. You see the aisles on either side with rows of columns and arches delineating that. You see the windows, it's called the clerestory, above the aisles, letting light into the nave. But at the end, you have that semicircular apse with a half dome there, full of mosaics. And this is going to give us our first hint, even though this is an early Christian form, the basilica, the apse at least is decorated in a early Byzantine style. And that's what I want to focus on for a moment, using what we call mosaic, little colored stones and pieces of gold and glass to depict, in this case, the saint that this church was dedicated to, Saint Apollinaris. So you see him as the bishop there, also as a shepherd, right? The shepherd of that diocese. And so you've got the sheep around him, you've got the cross above him, you have angels. Notice that you have what looks like an earthly scene, a man with sheep in fields with trees. But as you get up to heaven, it's not a blue sky with clouds, it turns into gold. This is something we'll see is very typical of Byzantine art, that the heavens are this otherworldly kind of golden thing. On the right, you see a close-up of Saint Apollinaris. And it's amazing the detail that they could do in mosaic. Now, that was a basilica. In the same city in Ravenna, at the time of Justinian, they built a centrally planned church. And this is dedicated to Saint Vitalis. So this is Basilica Santa Vitale in Ravenna. And from the floor plan on the right, you can see it's an octagon with half domes kind of instead of the aisle. And then it's going to have a dome over the central octagon. There is an apse on the top part. It's east, facing east geographically, but on this floor plan, it's towards the top of the plan is an extended semicircle, which is the apse. And this, even more than San Apollinaris, is just what I like to call a riot of color. I mean, it's just dedicated, with the gold mosaic representing the heavens. And then you've got colorful mosaics. And notice that that's actually Jesus in the apse sitting on the globe of the earth, if you will. He's depicted as a Roman here, not as a Jew, so he's not bearded, but he's sitting there with angels, and then bishops are kind of approaching him on the side. Now that's in the apse, but on the left side, you can see how almost every exposed part of the walls and ceiling are covered with these rich mosaics. And this is the style, even though this isn't Italy, that came from the East and is going to be perfected, almost to an extent exaggerated, in Constantinople in the East itself. Now, before we leave these two and talk a little bit more systematically about Byzantine architecture and artistic style, I just want to give you two slides that also come from San Vitale that has something to do with our Byzantine emperors. This is a slide of the Empress Theodora. She's the wife of Justinian, and she's there with her ladies at court and some court officials, and she's actually bringing the chalice, the goblet of wine to offer for Eucharist, or what we would call the sacrament. And opposite, on the other side of the aisle there, is Justinian himself, and he has a golden palette, which is going to have the bread for the offering, but he's there with the bishop, Maximianus, and court officials and soldiers. By the way, the soldiers on the left, you see a green shield with what looks like a gold X, and it has like a tall, thin gold P. That's actually a rho, not a P. And so that's the he and the rho. That's the monogram for Christos. So these are Christian soldiers here. So this is meant to whet your appetite. We're sliding from basilica into centrally planned churches, and I'm giving you a taste of what mosaics can look like. But I want to talk for just a moment a little bit more systematically about architecture and art, and then we're going to see the mother of all Byzantine churches, Hagia Sophia. So let me just give you a couple points of summary for Byzantine architecture and then Byzantine artistic style. We're going to have this new innovative style. It's still Roman in terms of its engineering, its use of arches and vaults, and particularly domes. But there are a lot of Greek architectural and artistic elements, and increasing, when I say Oriental, I mean things from like Persia and further east. So the Greco-Roman features include columns, arches, vaults, and domes, as I've mentioned. The Eastern influences are the rich, rich ornamentation. I've already used this expression, riotous use of color, not just in mosaic, but we'll see in some of the slides I have of Hagia Sophia, what we call polychrome marble and stonework. But the mosaics, as beautiful and detailed as they are, it's not like Renaissance art will be, which is very realistic. It's not even the realism that the classical Greeks and Romans achieved. It becomes very flat and two-dimensional for reasons we'll describe in a moment, but it's because they start moving to what we call spiritualized representation rather than terrestrial or realistic representation. So with that background, let's look at Hagia Sophia, and this is what she looks like from the south. Those of you who've been to Istanbul, the Blue Mosque is behind me when I'm taking this picture. So this is actually the side of the church facing south. The entry is on the left. You enter a church from the west, and the apse, or where the altar was to the east. Now, by the way, this is not the way it would have looked when Justinian built it. First of all, it would not have 4 minarets on it. Okay, so those were added when it was turned into a mosque. And it wasn't pink or salmon colored for different reasons. Turks through the ages have painted this as they've done repairs in different colors, and that's not what it would have looked like to Justinian or throughout Byzantine history. And although that looks kind of unfamiliar, and she's an old queen of Constantinople, showing her age. She's approaching 2,000 years here. It's an amazing, amazing place. And the real richness and beauty is on the inside, not the outside, which is a very Christian idea, right? I mean, it's the interior person that matters. It's the soul and not the physical body. So let's just give you a few points about Hagia Sophia. I'll show you some floor plans. We'll talk about its amazing dome and why that was such an engineering success and feat, and then we'll look at some pictures. So as we mentioned, Hagia Sophia in Greek means holy wisdom. It was the chief church of Constantinople from the outset, from Constantine's transformation of Byzantium into the Eastern Roman capital. It was the third church on this site, the earlier two Hagia Sophias having been destroyed. So Justinian rebuilt this one. And the architects, you don't need to know their names, Isidore and Anthemius, but they were Greeks. And the real thing that is a feature of this is it reconciled the basilica and central plans. Central dome is just over 100 feet in diameter. Now, of course, St. Peter's is huge, and even the Pantheon, a Roman one, is bigger than this. But this is one of the largest domes in antiquity and the Middle Ages. And we'll talk about this feature in a slide, 2 slides from now, how you make the dome fit on a square rectangular base. It's by these little curved triangles we call pendentives. But what happens is you don't see where the dome, how the dome is placed on top of the square or the rectangle. So it seems like the dome is just kind of hanging from heaven. When when Justinian completed this church and dedicated it, he was reported to have explained, his court historian Procopius said that Justinian pronounced, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." The idea being that the church of Hagia Sophia, that Justinian built, was more opulent, rich, and more worthy of worship than Solomon's temple in Jerusalem had been. Now, here is the floor plan. So you see on the left, there's a courtyard that goes off of it, but you have 2 different narthexes, or what we would call foyers, so an outer narthex and an inner narthex. And then you enter the church through a half dome, and then you proceed in the main wide open space under the main dome, and then you go farther right through another half dome, and then there's kind of a cascade of half domes around that, the easternmost of which is the apse where the altar was. So the dome and the symmetry of this building, it's almost square, makes it a centrally planned church, but you can see how it's still a basilica. So the half domes extend the dome space into the large central nave, whereas to the north and the south of that nave are areas that are supported by columns in 2 levels. So those are the north aisle and the south aisle. And then you still do have a nave, even though otherwise this looks like a centrally planned church. Now let's look at how that main dome is put on a square / rectangular base. Rectangular because the half domes extend the square out into a long rectangle. You can actually see if you look at the circle's in a square with dotted lines, and then you see like curved triangles. Those are the pendentives, and you can see how this works. Byzantines had two different ways of putting a dome on a square rectangular base. On the right, you have something called squinches. They have a square, and then they build arches on the corners of the squares, and then just kind of bridge the gap. It's kind of a makeshift way of doing it. You see on the left, you actually curve out those arches. So you've got curved triangles. You've got the smooth transition from the four main arches to the circular base and then the dome above. Now, this is reversed. The apse should be on the right, the east, but I couldn't turn my image upside down without making the words on the image I borrowed upside down. So anyway, east is on the left and west is on the right. So you're entering on this from the right. You enter a house dome, you see the pendentives in the salmon color, then you've got the dome in the purple, and then it comes down a level to a half dome, and then there's another half dome in the apse. Here is a cross section of what you're going to see, oriented like that previous floor plan. You're entering from the east on the right through the foyers or narthexes. Then you enter the first half dome, and then you are under the main dome, which has a half dome on the east and the west, but just a flat surface and colonnades on the north and the south. And then you can see the other half dome on the left, and then eventually the apse. Now, enough of that. Let's see some real pictures, and let's enter Hagia Sophia. I just took these in February, so these are pretty new pictures. So here we are on the outside of the church, coming in through the porch, and we're going to come into the narthex. Now, they use a lot of brick and concrete in Roman and Byzantine constructions. This would have been sheathed or covered in marble, so the outside would look a lot more gleaming and beautiful than now. But now it's kind of like, the clamshell that is covering the pearl. So we go through the door, and this is the narthex. And so you can see the vaulted ceiling and the gold mosaic. And then you have, and I'll show you a closer picture of this in a moment, but you have the polychrome marble stonework on the walls, and you see large doors. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 doors. The central three, the largest, the central three is actually the imperial door. So that's how the emperor would enter the church. Now, just looking at the stonework for a moment, look at how this polychrome marble works. They use red and purple, what's called porphyry, green marble, different colors of marble. And sometimes you'll see that they even take a sheath of marble and they cut it in half and lay it open. And so you get those interesting patterns, which are kind of like, look at the one on the left, the upper left. You see that kind of design? That's the same piece of marble that they've cut in half, and then they folded it open like a book. And so the patterns or veins in the marble on the right are mirrored when they laid it open on the left. So that's just beautiful. So it's not just the mosaics they use to make their interiors just gorgeous. And you go through the imperial door, and oh my gosh, look what you see. So we're entering under the first half dome, and then you can see the main dome, and then the half dome across from you, and then the smaller half domes, including the central one, which is the apse. And it's just amazing. Now, it was made a mosque when the Ottoman Turks took the city in 1453 and remained a mosque until the father of modern Turkey, Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turkish Republic, decided it's been a church, it's been a mosque, it's a world site for everyone, let's make it a museum, which was this nice compromise. But just recently, the current president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, who is an Islamicist himself, has converted back into a mosque. And we'll see in a moment that they've covered up some of the mosaics and the pictures of Christ and Mary for that reason. And so if you've been there before, if you go soon, you'll be a little sad that its function as a mosque, because you can't have any of the Christian art open and visible. And you see some things. When it was a museum under Ataturk, they left like those big discs with the Arabic writing on it. Those are the names of Allah and Muhammad and the first 4 rightly guided caliphs, the first successors of Muhammad. And you see some Arabic script in the dome, etc. So it was kind of a combination of the original Byzantine Christian artistic program and then later the Turkish editions. We're looking at the side. This is going to be at the north aisle. south aisle, excuse me, if we're looking east. So we've got two levels, two floors of that aisle. And instead of a half dome there, it just has a flat tympanum with lots of windows that let in the light. Look at that. That's turning around, looking back at the imperial door. So this is the entrance. Okay. And in fact, over the entrance was what was called the Empress's Lodge. This is where the Empress would watch her church services from her own kind of private area. And look at that polychrome. Wow, that beautiful marble stonework. This is looking at one of the smaller half domes on the side there. You see how you've got a half dome and then a half dome and then eventually the pendentive on the right and then the main dome. We've got that beautiful, beautiful carved stonework as well as the polychrome work around there. This is kind of in the southeast corner under the main dome. It used to be all marble flooring and stonework on the flooring, but since it's been transformed back into a mosque, they've laid these awful carpets down. I don't like the color very well, but they left this part exposed because these circles represent where different court officials stood, and that large circle in the middle is where the emperor was crowned. So that's kind of an interesting bit of Byzantine history. This is my son and I standing in front of where the apse was. Now it has a mihrab, a niche pointing towards Mecca. So when it's used for Muslim prayers, Muslims know how to orient themselves when they worship. Let me look at that. Now, over the apse was a mosaic that was uncovered when it became a museum of Mother Mary and her child Jesus. But now that it's a mosque, they've had to put these drapes to kind of cover it up. They fortunately haven't taken the mosaics down or covered them up with plaster or anything, but they've covered them with these cloths. So here's an earlier picture showing you, wow, that glory of Mary holding the infant Jesus, who is clothed in gold robes, sitting on a gold background. This is looking into the main area from one of the side aisles. And that's looking at the south aisle from the main nave. Now, because this is in the narthex, the foyer, here you're actually able to see some uncovered Byzantine mosaic. This is the mother and child, of course, but you have two emperors presenting Mary and the baby Jesus with something. It's Constantine on the right. He's offering a walled city to the mother and child. So that's him offering the city of Constantinople. On the left, it's Justinian, and he's offering the church. He's offering Hagia Sophia to them. Okay, but you have to imagine that in the original church, a lot of this now that's just kind of covered with this yellow paint and plaster would have all looked like this, covered with gold mosaic and different religious scenes. So that's Hagia Sophia, and if you're going to Constantinople, that will be one of your highlights. Now that we've been exposed to the Byzantine mosaics, let me just systematically tell you a few things about them, and then I'm going to take you a little church in Greece to show you a smaller Greek monastery, Byzantine monastery, but has some gorgeous mosaics in it. Here are some features of Byzantine mosaics. You know, the Hellenistic Greek kings in the East actually started mosaics. They were using colored stones to make patterns and pictures in floors originally. And the Romans picked up on that. In Roman baths, etc., they have a lot of mosaics in the floors. And some of the earliest Christian basilicas also had mosaic floors. In fact, the Church of the Nativity here in Bethlehem, just south of here in Jerusalem, is a church that was originally built by Constantine's mother, Helena. And later, Justinian rebuilt a church there. But the first Constantinian church had mosaic floors. And to this day, when you go in the Justinianic church, they've got some wooden trap doors they open up so you can look 3 or 4 feet down below the current floor level and see those patterns on the floor. But as the Byzantines, as the Greek-speaking Christian Romans became more adept at portraying religious art mosaic and started showing saints and Mary and Jesus mosaic, you don't want to walk on saints or on God made flesh or the mother of God, right? And so the mosaics move up to the walls and eventually onto the vaults and the domes. So they started as Roman mosaics in the floors, but now we're going to have glass and precious jewels and colored stones set in walls and ceilings. And increasingly, this is a feature of Byzantine mosaic, a lot of gold tesserae. They use gold with glass over it. Tesserae are the little pieces that you use to set in a mosaic. And this is a point I've alluded to. It's spiritualized representation rather than realistic representation. It's not trying to be 3D. It's not trying to actually show your muscles and the wavy garments and that kind of thing. In fact, Byzantine mosaics tend to be notably two-dimensional, flattened, because they're not talking about this world. They're talking about a spiritual world in another dimension. The eyes tend to be oversized, and that's because eyes are the window to the soul, etc. So you have more of a spiritualized representation rather than a realistic representation. And what is interesting from a historical point of view is the saints and Mary and Jesus all have halos. In almost consistently, Byzantine emperors and empresses have halos. So these imperial figures are kind of assumed into the saintly number, if you will. And then usually on the main dome, and Hagia Sophia doesn't have this anymore because there's this Arabic script up there, but there would have been an image of Christ gazing down on the world. And Christ is the ultimate emperor, Pantocrator, ruler of all, ruling the universe. And the idea is you're entering a church and you're leaving this world and you're coming into the spheres of eternity, into the spiritual realms. And that's where you can see Christ ruling as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go to this little church not too far, kind of between Delphi and Thebes, if any of you know central Greece. It's called Hosius Lucas, St. Luke. And it's actually a double church. And you can see this is in a later period in Byzantine history when they're not as wealthy as they used to be, but they do their best. They don't have polychrome marble work anymore, but they do a lot of beautiful things with brickwork. But they're still going to do mosaics inside. And when they can't afford the mosaics, they're going to do frescoes. So let's go inside Hosius Lucas. Well, let's look at the layout. First of all, you have the main church, which is dedicated to Luke proper. And then the upper right, you've got a second church, which is dedicated to Mary. They consistently call her a Theotokos, Mother of God. So not Mother of Jesus, but Mother of God, because Christ is God the Son, right? So let's just look. Still, you have some of that polychrome marble work, but we're walking into the church dedicated to Mary, and then suddenly the dome rises above you and the half dome. So there's an example of Christ Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of all, with the archangels kind of surrounding him and the heavenly court. Now that is a fresco. Okay, it was too large to do with all the mosaics. They didn't have the money to do that large with space mosaics, I should have said. This is actually an example not of pendentas, but squinches. You see how the dome, you've got this kind of weird little kind of squat, don't have quarter domes kind of filling in the corners there to change a square into an octagon and then a circle, if you will. Now, here's an example of some Byzantine emperors and empresses, and then some saints below. Here is a nativity scene. So you see the baby Jesus wrapped up like a mummy there, and you have Mary, the star shining down. You've got the angels and the shepherds. And that's all done with mosaics. Isn't that amazing? Here's an example of, this is Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, the Last Supper. Jesus is washing Peter's feet while the other apostles watch. One of the dudes is eager. He's taking his sandal off, ready to be next in line there. And then here you have what you always have over the apse. Mary, the mother of God, baby Jesus in her lap. Well, he looks like a little man there. The Greek letters, by the way, if you know a little Greek, you can kind of make out what's going on there. You have a mu and a rho, and that squiggly line, it's what we call a nomen sacrum, a sacred name. It's an abbreviation. So that's Maria. And on the right, you have a theta and an upsilon with the squiggle, and that's going to be, the Theotoku, I think is what that is. So that's Mother of God. Okay. And that's it. So a little bit rambling. And if you're going to Turkey, you're not going to Hosius Lucas, but I wanted you to see what a church liked in all of its glory, so you could imagine what Hagia Sophia would have looked like. What you need to know, though, is Constantinople was filled with hundreds of churches. And every city and town would have had churches, some small, and wouldn't all be huge cathedrals, but they would all have had this same kind of artistic plan and the mosaics and this rich otherworldly effect. It's such a difference. It's not, different is not better or worse. I mean, I love Gothic cathedrals in the Western tradition. I certainly love Renaissance, particularly Baroque architecture and art. Michelangelo and his sculpture, how can you beat that? But it's a different approach. We're trying to portray spiritual otherworldly realities with a gold and then the features that are more spiritual than realistic. But in a time, particularly in later periods of Byzantine history, when they're under attack from all sides, they're putting all their efforts into building and decorating these churches. So no matter what happens to their earthly empire, they're holding out for that heavenly empire. So I hope this little introduction, brief survey of Byzantine history, just to kind of set the stage for the people who built these churches and showing you Hagia Sophia and this particular church has whetted your appetite, and that you're going to make plans to go to Turkey sometime and enjoy all of its history, the Greek, the Roman, the Byzantine, the Ottoman Turkish, all of it. It's great. It's a wonderful place with wonderful people. And thank you for letting me share some time with you and something I really love. Greek-speaking Christian Romans. Give them a Book of Mormon, they would have been perfect. Okay, Greek-speaking Christian Romans with the gospel, that's all I need. Anyway, thanks for letting me be with you today. I hope that you've enjoyed this kind of rambling presentation, and that your future presenters on different phases of Turkish history and its cultures and religions will just open your minds to the richness of its history. Take care.